Well, hey, everybody. My name is Brad. Welcome, by the way, to our folks that are watching this at home here in the U.S. and Canada and literally around the world. Yeah. It's good to be together. I wasn't going to do this, but Alfie encouraged me to do this. The last several weeks, we've been encouraging you to consider, if you're new to Copper Hills, to attend something called Copper Hills 101. And it's really the basics of what Copper Hills is about, what we believe, and so on. Well, that was going to happen this Wednesday, but we're going to shift that because I'm going to get put up on a hoist, and they're going to take my hip out, and they're going to plug a new one in on Wednesday. And the chances are I might not be up to the evening get-together. There's just a slight chance that would be the case. And so... but we're going to do that in August, and it's one of the highlight times that for me to have with folks that are new to Copper Hills and considering that. So you can think ahead to that, and we'll tell you more as that approaches. So I want to give you a quick on-ramp. If you're new to Copper Hills, just joining us maybe for the first time today online, or you've missed the last couple of weeks. We've been talking about the way. Well, what's the way all about? Well, what it is it's a reflection back to our ancestors a couple of thousand years ago who were the ones that initiated what you and I are participating in our lives, and that's the church. It wasn't called the church back then. It was just this ragtag group of people who had encountered somebody that revolutionized their lives. And they lived a whole new life out of what this person had done for them personally. Of course, we're talking about Jesus, and God manifest in the power and presence of Jesus coming into this world and giving his life for us and coming back to life again. And there were a group of 100 or so, 120 people that experienced that, along with an infilling of God's Spirit, which is mystical and magical and amazing in itself, which is the transformative power for us. And then out of that experience, they lived in such a way in their culture that it changed their culture. It changed it so much so that over the next several decades and even centuries, there would be people that would write about these people who were followers of Jesus that made such a profound difference in their world that they became known as the Way, or in some cases even known as a third race. They lived so differently than that. Well, that would suggest there might be at least two other ways that people lived, and there were. There was the Roman way, which was... If you'll just integrate into our culture, if you'll assimilate into our values, you'll get along with us just fine. Life will be pleasurable and it will be delightful, and you'll make tons of money and you'll be on the in, and everything will be good for you if you'll just assimilate into our culture. Well, there was a second way, and that was the Jewish way, the Hebrew way, which was to isolate from culture, to stand back and have their own marketplace and their own schools and their own gatherings and their own religious practices. And they just isolated from the culture, and that was a second way. But then these followers of Jesus come along, and they don't assimilate and they don't isolate, they infiltrate their culture. And when we think of infiltration, it's easy to think about infiltrating with a sense of making demands or rebelling or revolting or resisting the status quo, to undermine, to undercut, to usurp the powers. But they didn't do any of that stuff. They didn't power up their social media account and blast Caesar for who he was and what he did. They didn't picket on the streets. They didn't do that kind of thing. Instead, they infiltrated with grace and love and kindness and goodness and truth, for sure. But they did what their friend Peter said, like, whenever you're asked to defend your faith, do it. But do it with kindness and respect of those. And this is how they did it. And they suffered horribly for who they were. It's this way with almost every new kind of significant move that happens within our culture. There's this continuum of either resisting it or embracing it. And that's exactly what happened with this new movement. It was resisted to the extreme, and it was also embraced to the extreme. But how did it all happen, right? What were the factors that went into it? For sure, it was that Jesus Christ had come back to life. That in itself, if he wasn't God, if he was just a human being that came back to life, that'll leave a mark, right? That's a story you'll tell your grandkids. But when it's God, apparently you tell the story generation after generation, because no other God had ever done that before, because there was no other God, and he alone was God, and he came into this world to do that. And they would point back, these ancestors of ours early on, that was the deal. It was him. It was Jesus alive. It was what that meant, that they said, this is what has transformed our lives. But there were other factors within the culture, other than just talking about it, that shaped the culture for them. One of them we looked at a couple of weeks ago, and that's just the dignity with which Jesus saw everybody that he came in contact with. Well, that dignity was so profound for him and these followers of this third race that it was always expressed in some way. And the way that they would express it was with compassion for people. I want to look at that tonight with you a little bit and reflect back on how it was that they were so uniquely compassionate to those that were least likely to be receive compassion, and how that changed them. Part of my research in this project has been to read a bunch of books, and I found one that the title captured me. Why on earth did anyone become a Christian in the first 3 centuries? That's an interesting read. It's a short little book. You can get it. Amazon has it. But the whole premise of it, behind it, is that in the first century, something that was really significant about these followers of Jesus, that in the middle of not receiving compassion themselves because of what they believed, they were the hallmark of compassion givers in their culture. Do you know how often it is that if you're not treated well, you become like a victim and you victimize other people? That's just the normal path. They could so easily have stood back from that and go, like, what would we care about this culture? Why would we care about Caesar? Why would we care about those that mistreat us so much? Why would we have compassion for them? Because they have none for us, not 1 ounce of it. They're taking our property, they're taking our lives. Like, why would we do that? And it's in the context of that where the book says, why, if that under such duress and such pressure, why would anyone want to be a follower of that way? Because they were such compassionate people, such kind and generous and good people, that they made their mark because of compassion. Which leads me in my life to ask, for me, the obvious question. Would people look at my life and go, one of the marks of your life is how compassionate you are with people who might just not be easy compassion receivers? Would that mark your life? Would people around you at work and in the neighborhood, your family members, who sometimes they're the hardest to be compassionate to, would they say, hey, one of the things that marks me as a follower of Jesus, marks you, is the unbelievable depth of compassion that you have? Well, there were 2 reasons why this group of Jesus followers early on had this remarkable, outstanding, get your attention compassion. Was, first of all, they saw the profound impact that giving someone who is not normally given compassion, when they're given compassion, how that affects them. It actually shapes their world. It transforms their lives. And here they saw that all the time in Jesus' life. Every day, it's just how he lived. And eventually that rubs off on you. You go, what you do for other people, how you treat other people, the compassion that you have for them. I've watched what that does, and it's incredibly attractive. I would like to impact lives in that way as well. But here's the second thing, maybe even more impactful than the first, is that they discovered they each had been recipients of the greatest act of compassion that any human being had ever received. And it's this. We just celebrated it. It's this act of compassion that caused God to come into this world through Jesus Christ. Though he was equal with God, he did not consider equality with God something to hold on to. Instead, he humbled himself and became human. And then he humbled himself some more in that he was subjected to torture, and then humbled himself even further to death on a cross, the most humiliating death ever. And this was for them, and it's for you and me, and there's been no greater act of compassion in human history, in all of the universe, than that right there. And if that does not grab our hearts, Or let me say it the other way. If compassion is hard for you, if it's hard for me, might it just be that we have forgotten how incredibly compassionately we have been treated among those least likely to receive it. And when we see the power of compassion and we experience it for ourselves, it absolutely has a transformative effect. So now you have to imagine that kind of compassion in a culture that abandoned babies who were born with disabilities simply because they had disabilities. That's not compassion. You see, this was a culture where compassion was on display for its starkness. Like bright diamonds against a black velvet backdrop, they just sparkled. You know something? Compassion sparkles in our culture too, because there isn't always a lot of it. There's a lot of compassion, it appears, for people whom we like, who are of our similar persuasion and values and faith and place in life and demographic and political persuasion and those kinds of things. But it's harder when people aren't in that category. This is what this culture was like. It was a culture that enslaved you if you couldn't pay a debt. Not exactly compassion, right? It's a culture where if you were sick or if you were a burden to your family, you weren't put in a care home. You were placed at the curb. That was just easier. It's a culture where it was considered a better use of funds to execute petty criminals than try even to incarcerate or rehabilitate them. It was a culture where women were seen as more indentured slaves than worthy of the tender respect and love of their husbands. Not much compassion. And if God forbid, if there was a pandemic that would break out, as it did several times, because when it did, whole cities would just be abandoned and literally left, that the critically ill were caring for the critical ill while everybody else left and they were left to die together. No, you see, when compassion lands in that kind of an environment, it stands out. I would tell you today, it's my conviction that when followers of Jesus understand the dignity that all people have, and then they have a broken-hearted compassion in our culture today, it stands out almost as starkly as it did then. And it was into this culture that Jesus would daily and intentionally go to those least likely to be treated with much measure of compassion, and he would treat them with a kind of dignity that fueled a response of compassion. We are so fortunate to have some of the earliest manuscripts from that era, literally within decades of Jesus' walk on earth, that documented Jesus' compassion, tell us story after story of how Jesus did this, and those have been preserved for us. Do you know how blessed we are to have these written documents? Well, we have them. One of them that we have was likely written no more than 50 years after Jesus' death and resurrection. And it tells the story of one day Jesus going about his just regular daily routine, an ordinary day, and he happens to bump into a guy who is suffering from what was thought in that era to be a highly contagious and deadly disease called leprosy. You might have heard of it. And when Jesus bumps into it, because we already know him so well, what do you think he's going to do? He's going to help him out, right? Of course. In that day, proper protocol, if you had been infected with leprosy and you were going to go out in public, though that was somewhat rare, was as you walked through the streets out of a health concern for others, you had to shout the words as loud as you could, "Unclean, unclean," so everybody else could get out of the way and not get this disease. It was just common courtesy to do that. And so when Jesus encounters this person, then he may well have said as well, "Unclean, unclean," which Jesus knew. Jesus, of course, is going to engage his life. This is what we know. It's so predictable, isn't it? Well, this preserved document that we have tells us that those around Jesus who saw him respond to this individual, do you know what they observed about Jesus, what they said they saw in him? It's recorded for us in Mark 1:41. It says, these are my words now, when we saw what he did, we saw that he did it because he was filled with compassion. Means he was overflowing. It oozed out of him. It was a natural thing for him to do. He didn't have to sit and think, am I gonna, should I, is it proper, is it not, what happens if I get it? None of that stuff. He just dives into it because compassion is who he is. Or he might have said it in his own language, which would have been this word, hold on, buckle up, splagnisomai, splagnisomai. Now you wanna know that, don't you? For sure. Here's what it means. It means to suffer with in the depths of my being. It's when you actually feel in your gut the heartbreak and pain that someone else is feeling. It's a visceral kind of thing that you have. You see, you don't have compassion. You feel compassion before you have compassion, before you act on it. Someone else's suffering becomes your suffering. And you suffer alongside them. That's what compassion is. So when Jesus sees this guy with leprosy, he doesn't go, that will make a great story one day. His heart is engaged with the suffering of this man. And he does what he can in that moment. That's compassion. My oldest son is an ER doc at a level 1 trauma center in Minnesota. Several months ago, maybe it's almost a year ago now, we were talking about the kinds of trauma that come into the emergency room that he has to deal with. And I asked him, Aaron, how does that impact you? What does that do to you internally? He explained that he's trained to focus and to deal medically with whatever trauma is and to be guided by his training and good science. And that would be the kind of approach I would want my doctor to have if I land up in the ER. Well, that's all well and good, till one day he was telling me a little boy, the age of his oldest son, came in after a car accident. So he cut away the little boy's clothing to assess kind of the nature of the injuries, and as he pulled the little boy's tattered jeans, he noticed he was wearing the same Spider-Man underwear that he had put on his son that morning. And suddenly, compassion took over. Not that he's not compassionate, he is. But you see, there was a visceral response. There was something inside that suddenly that little boy could be his little boy. That's what compassion is, real compassion. Fake compassion, pretend compassion, put on compassion. It can do some really good things, but it's not sustainable and it drains us. But when we're really engaged with those around us who hurt and we engage them in that way, that could be me. Something else takes over. And this is the kind of compassion Jesus' friends saw in Jesus, saw the effect in other people's lives, saw the impact in their own lives, and they no longer put on compassion. It's what they were. It's what they became. This happens often to us, I suppose, where we struggle with compassion and we do our best to muster it and we do good things out of it, and yay for us. That's good. It really is good to do that. But it seems if you look at Jesus' life, he's way more concerned about the motive behind what we do than what we do. And so he is here in this way. Jesus' friends saw him do this all the time. There's another time that we're told about in one of these historical documents written by a medical doctor named Luke. He tells us that he thoroughly investigated all of the claims that people had made about Jesus. He investigated their eyewitness accounts to see if they were true or not. And then he wrote his account. We know it as Luke, but it's really it's a historical document that's 40, 50 years after Jesus' death and resurrection. In it, he tells us the story one day where Jesus is coming into a town and he meets a group of mourners that are leaving town, and they're carrying the body of a boy. And of course, they're tragically mourning and they're sad. And Jesus finds out at some point that the woman leading the procession is the little boy's or the boy's mom. We don't know how old the boy was. But she had also become a widow not that long ago as well. What a tragic story, right? Tragic story. As Dr. Luke records this in Luke 7:13, he says that when Jesus experienced that, it's recorded this, that Jesus' heart went out to her in compassion. It's easy to think about Jesus when you hear about the the compassion that he has, that he might just be what we might refer to as a highly sensitive person, an HSP. Somebody who's like an extreme feeler and just can't stand the sight of blood and pain, and so Jesus just steps in because he's just so sensitive, right? It's the kind of person who frightens easily and is affected by other people's mood or pain and care way too much and too deeply about what people think about them. There's actually an argument against Jesus in that way. But then when you stop and think about it, you can't ignore from Jesus how other events make Jesus look anything like a highly sensitive person. All 4 eyewitness accounts tell us of a time that they saw Jesus exploiting, or saw people exploiting the poor in the temple courtyard, and Jesus takes out a whip and he chases them away, scattering their money and flipping over their workspace. And he shouts at them, "How dare you?" This is not typical highly sensitive people. This is highly volatile people. You would expect to see it there. But then as you peel back this a little bit further, you see what Jesus was upset about. You know what he was upset about? The lack of compassion of the religious folks for the poor, the weak, and the needy. It's like Jesus is almost militant about the lack of compassion that he sees. It's so innately part of him. He sees it so readily. Did you know that Jesus' 2 most famous parables, these are stories with a moral message, are about compassion? Remember the prodigal son? A boy who comes to his dad and says, "Dad, I want the inheritance before you die. It's just okay if you die too, because then I just get it really quick." And dad, compassionately, I guess, gives him his inheritance. Kid squanders the whole thing. It's all gone. And with no place to go, son comes back home, and this is dad's response. "So he returned home to his father, and while he was still a long way off, his father saw him coming, filled with love and compassion. He ran to his son and embraced him and kissed him." The second most famous is the Good Samaritan. Again, it's a story of religious people who you would expect to be compassionate. Walk right by a guy who's near death beside the road, and it's an unlikely person who in his culture experienced no compassion, who has compassion and takes care of this person. Jesus makes heroes of these people. We read in Luke 10, "Then the despised Samaritan came along, and when he saw the man, he felt compassion for him." Over and over again, this is what we see from Jesus. This provokes, as I said, for me, it has all week as I've thought about this, what the level of compassion, genuinely so, is in my life. Maybe it does for you. Maybe you can't help but sit here or watch from home and go, I wonder if I have that kind of compassion. I wonder what my level of compassion really is like. As I said, it's easy and natural to be compassionate to people who we naturally and easily love. Like maybe it's our spouse or our kids or grandkids, maybe it's a boyfriend or girlfriend or BFF, until they disappoint us, they disobey us, they don't do what we want when we want it to do, and then compassion becomes tricky. It becomes a little more difficult. So it isn't only, apparently, that it's people that we love or like or close to that it's easy to be compassionate. It's only easy to be compassionate to them until they don't do what we want them to do. And Jesus talked about a different kind of compassion. You see, compassion to Jesus was not something that you can turn on and turn off like water faucets. It's always on. It's a constant, innate part of life, which many people reject. Here's what it requires. It requires resources of personal strength, and it requires wisdom in action. Compassion is a matter of who we are. It's not primarily a decision of what we will do. You can't afford to be compassionate. You can afford to be compassionate and even wasteful and lavish and excessive with compassion only if you know that there is an abundant supply of compassion for you, toward you, by someone who has appropriate and unlimited supply of compassion for you, and that is Jesus Christ. We can't have his kind of compassion without him. Jesus acts in compassionate ways because he is compassionate. And this is the secret that the first century followers of the way got. One of them writes this late in his life. In 1 John 4:19, we read, "We love because he first loved us." In other words, we have the capacity for compassion because he has that for us. I don't know if you recall this, but week 1, I referenced the letter that had been written by a guy by the name of Dignitas, who was writing to a Roman elite about these followers of the way. Apparently, they'd begun to make some ripples in the culture, and this elite, someplace in Rome, wants to know what they're about. He's a little confused by them. He doesn't know if they can be trusted. He's not sure about them, and his friend Dignitas writes him a letter to try to describe to him, this is who these people are, and this is how they function. Well, at one point in this letter, I'm going to read another section from it, Dignitas writes this about what he's discovered about these followers of Jesus, who they are the ones that understand this passage I just read. We love because he first loved us. This is what he writes. How will you love him who has first loved you? And if you love him, you will be an imitator. Not just imitate like in an imperative kind of way, but rather imitate as a consequence of being loved by him. You'll be an imitator of his kindness, and do not wonder that a man may become an agitator or an imitator of God. He can if he is willing. For it is not by ruling over his neighbors or by seeking to hold to the supremacy over those who are weaker. Remember, this is first century stuff. Or by being rich and showing violence toward those who are inferior, that happiness is found. Nor can anyone be these things become an imitator of God. But these things do not at all constitute his majesty. On the contrary, he who takes upon himself the burden of his neighbor, he who, in whatsoever respect he may be superior, is ready to benefit another who is deficient by distributing these to the need. Let me read it again. Who is deficient? He who, whatsoever things he has received from God, by distributing these to the needy, becomes a God to those who receive his benefits. He is an imitator of God. Then thou shalt see, while still on earth, that God in the heavens rules over the universe. What's he saying? I've discovered this, that as people take the burden of their neighbor and have compassion for them, they actually become a representation to their community of who God is and what he's like. In other words, what Dignitas is saying that he's observed is that if we deepen our awareness of the compassion shown to us, it's so deeply formative to us that we become compassion givers as well. After Jesus' death and resurrection, his followers must have remembered what Jesus had taught them and what he had shown them. We're told this, that they would provide financially for widows who could not support their families financially. They did that, not just for their widows, but for widows in the community. We're told stories that they would create very first versions of what we might call foster or adoptive services, orphanages and group homes, because of the number of parentless children that were around. We're told stories that they provided safe homes and food, often at their own expense in their own crowded home, for those who were fleeing oppression, poverty, and war. They refused to enslave or indenture those who would not pay their debts. They would forgive the debts, and they would even pay off other people's debts to free people so they were not enslaved. These first century followers were the first to set up groups of volunteers to visit people in prisons and bring them supplies and medicines, because the state wouldn't provide that for prisoners. And the only way they could is if family did, and many of them didn't have families that would. But these followers of Jesus would go into prisons, and this is what they would do. And they made a mark. They left an imprint, and they had learned that from Jesus. During the reign of Emperor Marcus Aurelius in AD 165, an epidemic broke out. It was not called COVID-19. The likelihood was it was smallpox, which is so deadly. It killed between 25 and 35% of the population in that season of Rome's life. And of course, we saw this recently ourselves. People respond in panic. But this is what they did. Healthy family members would flee their homes and leave the sick to die without anyone to look after them. They fled from their dearest family, throwing them out into the streets before they were dead and treating the unburied corpses as dirt, hoping thereby to avert the spread of this contagion of this fatal disease. Dionysius, not Diognetus, this is another person, this 3rd century bishop in Egypt, wrote this: heedless of danger, they took charge of the sick, ministering to them in Christ, and with them departed this life serenely, happy, for they were infected with the disease, drawing on themselves the sickness of their neighbors and cheerfully accepting their pains. That was normal. Isn't that remarkable? For me, as I look back on that, I go, well, no wonder they impacted their culture. No wonder their involvement and their engagement and their infiltration of the culture was a beautiful thing. It was confusing. Why would you do that? And they would then, because of what they'd done, be able to point to Jesus and what he had done for them. Over and over again, this is how they operated. And I see that happening here as well. Not that long ago, a group of people went down to Mexico to build a home at their own cost for a family that lived in this ramshackled shanty. And they built a home over the course of a week for them. And it left an imprint in that family, and it left an imprint in those that went. Because that's the nature of genuine compassion. In fact, one of the people who was part of that group was so moved by compassion for the juvenile immigrant crisis that's happening on this side of the border, she asked for a leave from her work and to volunteer with the federal government to try to find safe temporary housing for these children. Stepped aside from her daily job to commit herself to do that. That's compassion. I talked with her about it. I saw what drove her to do that. A genuine, I'm joining with you in your sorrow and hardship to be part of it. Every Wednesday, a group of women assemble chef-prepared meals in our little kind of preparation kitchen right over here, and they take it out, beautifully served in beautiful hand-printed bags, to cancer patients in our community who can't make food for themselves. But they don't just get top ramen. These are beautiful meals that are put together and given with grace and love. That's compassion. We have people who serve with Streetlight Usa. It's a residential trauma healing facility for adolescent females who have been victims of sexual abuse and sexual exploitation. And they do it, I know at least in one case, because this woman was a subject of that herself. And having seen what happens, she can step into that place, and it's genuine compassion for them. Just this last week, somebody in our church heard of a young lady coming back from a mission experience who, while she was gone just recently, had her laptop and her camera, and a month earlier her phone and some headphones stolen from her just as she came home. I don't know how he heard about it, but he heard about it. He stopped by this week in the office and said, here's $3,000 to give to her because I've had stuff stolen from me and I know what that feels like and the violation that's there. That's compassion. You see, you have to have compassion before you act on it. So what would we do with this? Well, here's what we could think about. We could take a close look inside, and then we could take a close look around. I think we have to come to a place where we think about the compassion that Jesus has shown us. So it might be good this week to spend a little bit of time thinking, has Jesus ever met you in a dark and dead-end place where he lifted you out of that? Has he ever forgiven you and restored you of the effects of some misdemeanor and mistaken behavior? Has he ever provided for you in a desperate situation? Has he ever lifted you out of a pit of despair? Has he healed your body of little things and big things, your emotions, your mind, when no one else could? Has he ever visited you in a prison of discouragement? Do you know why he did that? Because he loves you, and he's compassionate for you. He doesn't just look at you and me and go, oh, that's too bad you're discouraged. It's too bad you're sick. I'm really sad about how tough your life is. Not our God. He cared enough to come into this world. How much more could he do to prove that he's personally involved? No, his compassion engages us where we are. And then in his wisdom, oftentimes, more times than we recognize, he steps in and does something for us. But we need to reflect on that and think about that, for therein lies some source of compassion as well. And then we need to take a look around, take a look inside and take a look around. And we actually don't have to look outside of our immediate area of influence and presence. Do you know that there are people that you sit in this auditorium with tonight that would hope that somebody would be compassionate enough to say a word of encouragement or to help them in some way? Do you know that you and I have neighbors that are there right today? Do you know that there's people that we work beside who would respond to us if we were just compassionate to them in some way? Well, how would you know? Well, you can observe if you want to. We can all engage ourselves in the lives of people. Take notice, take interest. Do you know what you have in you and me? We have God's Spirit inside of us who knows things we don't know, and if we're willing, directs us. He's the God of compassion. So we need to take a look inside and then take a look around and watch what Jesus does. You game for that? Experiment. See what happens. Tell me the stories of what happens. I think as we are compassionate, our community, our culture actually changes in response to that. All right, would you stand for closing prayer, please? Jesus, you have modeled for us what compassion really, really looks like. And this week, might it be that we would take a little bit of time and to look inside, and by the power of your Spirit, be reminded of all the times, or at least a few, where you expressed unwarranted favor and compassion for us. May we delight in that and thank you for it and be humbled by it. And then may we lift our eyes from looking inside to look around, and let your Spirit guide us to take interest, to notice people, to, when we're prompted, just respond. Maybe the smallest act of compassion, it may be something bigger. But Jesus, may we not assimilate or isolate, but infiltrate this culture with compassion, so that the influence that you had in the first century would be the influence you have today, and our world would be shaped to become more like you, Jesus. This we ask in the power of your name with thanksgiving. Amen. Have a great week, everybody.